Welcome to the Talk Spot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined by Stephen and Joyce Singular, New York Times bestselling authors. Thank you guys for coming on.
Thanks for having us, Marcus.
Thanks.
So, so how are you guys doing? Are you up to any new books or any new projects going on?
We're writing a screenplay right now that's been optioned by a producer in Los Angeles. And so our son Eric, who worked with us on the Spiral Notebook, James Holmes' Aurora Theater shooting case, is also working with us on that.
Okay, nice. How far along is it?
Well, how many rewrites have we done?
Well,
now,
we've done several rewrites, and we think we're fairly close to completing it. Screenwriting is obviously very different from writing books, and they always come back and say, let's change this scene or that scene or alter this character a little bit. It's a fictional screenplay, an original idea. So we've made a lot of progress, and I think we're closing in on finishing it.
It's a different animal for sure, though, and we've learned a lot, and it's a really fun genre to work in because you can incorporate music and you can describe, the scenery, and so there's all these layers that you can play with, as opposed to just writing a book.
Yeah,
that's a very fair point. So you mentioned the Spiral Network, and that was one of the questions that I wanted to talk to you about, or not questions, or subjects I want to talk to you about, is that book and the topic of mass shootings. As you guys are probably both aware, in Thousand Oaks in California, there was a mass shooting at Borderline, which was a bar and grill. And I've actually been to that place a dozen or so times in my life. I live about 20 minutes, maybe 15 minutes from Borderline. And obviously I know that, I'm not the only person that, has gone there before. And I know a lot of other people have, been impacted by mass shootings. So yes, figured I'd ask you guys about that. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the book and the subject matter of mass shootings.
Well, so then what it's like to go to a place or to have a mass shooting take place in an area that you actually were, and it really gets your attention when it hits that close to home, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely feels that way. I mean, there's a person who owns a coffee shop in the city I live in, and he was one of the people that was murdered that night. Yeah,
it starts hitting closer to home, and you can't ignore it as much anymore. It's like we kind of called it when the unthinkable becomes thinkable. When these events happen, they've happened so frequently now that they're just sort of absorbed into the collective consciousness, and people aren't as shocked by that anymore, and that's pretty disturbing for our society.
Well, we as a family, and really more specifically probably Joyce and Eric, had attended the Aurora Theater, the complex where James Holmes carried out this crime. So we had actually been right there where the shooting occurred.
In that theater, in the actual theater. It's like a complex of about 9 theaters. Yep. And
that was getting pretty close to home. Yeah.
Yeah, so what was that? I guess, if you wouldn't mind maybe talking more about the Aurora shooting, who, what motivated the killer? Is he different in some ways than other mass shooters that have gone on rampages in the last,
what we found about that, well, I'll back up a little bit. On the night of July 20th, 2014, 2012, we woke up the next day, it was a Saturday, and to all these news reports of this shooting that had occurred at the theater. And so Steve and I, being, investigative journalists, of course, it got our attention. And we drove immediately to the apartment complex where they were looking for bombs. They had all these, equipment, very, very high-tech equipment. They were going through, all the people had been evacuated. They were talking about, this neighbor of theirs that who would have thought somebody like that could do something. So then we drove down a few miles to where the theater was, and it was all cordoned off with all the satellite trucks and reporters. And it was, the people were just starting to come out. They had sequestered the people that had been in those theaters that were survivors in a local high school. and they were just letting them out. It was a very hot morning, middle of the summer, and we began interviewing some of the people that had survived that event, and it was pretty traumatic, as you can imagine. And so we did, one thing led to another, and we started attending legal hearings. Of course, this was a little different because when we've written books about criminal cases in the past, we've had access to trials, and this thing became sealed very quickly. So we were forced to approach it from a different angle. And when we came home that day after, interviewing some of the survivors, we asked our son, it was the summer and it was his first year in college, and he was home with us, and we asked him, what do your friends think when events like this happen? Him being a millennial and we being baby boomers, we wanted to see, how the different generations were viewing these events. And of course, when these things happen, the talking heads on the television are all older people. You never got the point of view of the younger people. So we just started asking, what do they say about these things? And he kind of said, well, they post things on Facebook and say how sorry they are, and people will put hearts and things up for a while, and then it's totally forgotten again. But then we kept probing him, and we went a little deeper, and he said, you don't know how I grew up. And we didn't understand what he meant at the time, but he started opening up even more and explaining that growing up in the age of social media, the internet, a lot of kind of frightening, disturbing events, starting with Y2K, 9/11. He just kind of gave us a point of view that we hadn't really thought of, because we thought we were doing a pretty good parenting job. Being at home, in our profession, we worked at home, and so he was an only child, so we thought we had showered him with a lot of attention. But what he was saying was that having the access to the internet, for one thing, totally changed his life. And when we started thinking about that, we thought, that's true, because when most kids are bullied to some extent in schools, we were growing up, of course, everybody is a little bit. But when you add that added element of being bullied on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or what else, I mean, that ramps it up right there. And then he began talking about the kind of movies that he grew up with and the video games that he was exposed to. And a lot of the movies like Fight Club and The Matrix, and a lot of post-apocalyptic kind of doom and gloom type of scenarios.
Right. So basically what he was saying was, it became kind of the foundational sentence for the whole book. You don't know how I grew up. And like Joyce said, well, we looked at each other, and, not only had he had two parents who were in the house all the time, basically watching him. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the cultural influences on young men my age. And he said, I know guys who could have done what James Holmes, the Aurora theater shooter, did. And so we started, as Joyce said, in writing true crime books, which has been the main focus here. You have courtroom sessions and documents and interviews and all of those things. Because they shut that down, we had to try something different with this book. So our son sort of opened that up for us and said, why don't you look at the cultural things as opposed to just looking at the individual. You asked earlier about Holmes, and you said, is there something about him that's different from the other people? And there are several different things about that. Number one, in many, many of these cases, about 60 to 70%, the shooter dies. They just start shooting, and they shoot until the cops arrive, and then they're dead. Holmes shot about 270 rounds into that theater and then peacefully to them. So that was somewhat unusual. Secondly, he was a neuroscience student, a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado, one of 6 people in the entire country chosen to be in that program. So he was a Phi Beta Kappa. He had, great intelligence in the scientific arena. but there were things that he didn't have, and that's sort of what we began to look into as time went on. So we looked at him as an individual, kind of his story, his family, his background, his education. And then we went into these areas that Joyce laid out that our son was talking about. And then we went past our son and started interviewing other people his age, and their voices become kind of a chorus in the book. Basically, people 20 to 30, young men and women, who are sort of talking about those cultural influences. A lot of talk about and if you look at the list of people who've committed these crimes, it's in the book. It's listed near the end of the book. In almost every case, there's some usage of, or overusage, or overprescription of certain anti-anxiety, antidepressant drugs.
And benzodiazepines.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
or combinations of thereof.
The other thing that makes Holmes unusual, and I think this is very important, is that the crime occurs in July. In March and April, he goes to a therapist on the campus at the University of Colorado. He seeks out help because he knows he's in trouble. He knows he's having violent thoughts. He's playing violent video games a lot by now. And he tries to basically form a connection there and talk about his problems. And the woman who's his therapist starts prescribing just exactly what Joyce said. And instead of engaging and, sort of trying to understand the emotional part of this, she then doubles the dosage and then triples the dosage for these drugs. And it's the fact that he would seek out help, recognizing his own problems, I think is very important.
Let's dive more into, the drug usage, that being a commonality amongst these shooters. It seems like when these events happen, when these mass shootings occur, there's a lot of people, or there's a number of people that just jump to saying, we need more gun control. And I'm not saying that that's incorrect, but with these people, like you mentioned, some of these mass shootings are just happening with handguns or shotguns, right? There's something wrong with these people internally. So even if they didn't have access to, guns with more rounds or guns with higher capacity for rounds, they would still be doing some kind of crime ultimately, right?
Well, yeah, they could probably figure out how to blow up a building or something. You're right.
Yeah.
But having access to AR-15s, it makes it a little easier for them. And Holmes was able to order a lot of his weaponry online.
Yeah.
No problem, from other states, send them right to him.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course the semi-automatic weapons allow you to, kill more people more quickly. There was a video an audio played in court of the shooting itself. And that brought it home about as fast as possible. When you realize how much damage you can do in about 1 minute, with something shooting hundreds of rounds, it's pretty distressing.
And it's interesting to me that somebody like Holmes and some of these other young men that have felt very, had some kind of masculinity and crisis situation going on, what's the ultimate form of power in this society? It's a gun. And if you feel powerless for a great portion of, and then for that moment in time you have access to these super guns, probably makes you feel pretty powerful at that moment.
Yeah. The book does not talk a lot about gun control, although the shooting here at Aurora did change some of the statewide laws a little bit in terms of background checks and things like that. But we were looking at the cultural influences. For example, and this I don't know how old you are, but we're, like Joyce said, baby boomers who had a child pretty late. So we had no concept sort of the video game world and sort of entering into that and seeing, sort of how violent the games had become, how real they'd become, how they sort of operate and all of that. And that in itself was sort of eye-opening for us. We we grew up more in the, peace, love generation, and our son's friends are 20 years old and going to college and studying engineering.
And still playing those games.
Coming home and putting these very violent games up on the wall and, killing as many people as they could.
To decompress, sort of as a decompression mechanism.
Right. So he said, well, go back to what we were saying a little bit earlier. Let's talk about the drugs. Let's talk about video games. And then you start looking at James Holmes. Let's talk about isolation that's caused by some of the social media things or not being a part of that. Holmes is on this cocktail of two different drugs. By the time he was ready to commit his crime, he was playing violent video games 8 hours a day. He was in virtual total isolation after he dropped out of the PhD program. So these things sort of meshed in writing about it, and that's sort of the narrative of the book.
And when he was committing the crime itself, he had on headphones that were playing that kind of music that were in the video games, that kind of electronic music. And, I mean, it was almost as if the line between fantasy and reality was blurred at that moment. What was really real? Is killing all those people really real, or is it part of a video game?
He later said it was like being in a video game when he was there.
I mean, to answer a point that you raised, I'm probably 2 to 3 years older than your son, so I completely am very understanding of the culture that exists with younger men or men that are, 35 to late teens today. I am very familiar with some of those violent video games, violent type music, and just even violent content in general that's produced on television and the internet. But that was going to lead me to another question, was the idea of violent content's impact on people. Obviously, there are forces that exist out there that believe that consuming violent content, isn't actually negative towards a person's well-being. I mean, do you guys actually believe that that's true, or can listening to violent music and playing violent games and watching violent movies and television shows, does it actually impact a person's psyche in a negative way?
Well, I mean, I'll answer first, and then, Steve, you can answer for yourself. But I feel, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I feel that if someone is a normal person and doesn't have mental illness and they're watching violent things, maybe that doesn't impact them. But if you're mentally ill and you're watching it, maybe that does say something to you. It's really hard to make logical sense of a mentally ill brain. We try to apply logic to them, but it's not logical when a brain is sick with mental illness, like James Holmes.
One of the themes, one of the other phrases that our son used, Joyce just used, that we explored was masculinity in crisis. This idea. Our son, talked to us and pointed out something that was real obvious after he pointed it out. Like, a lot of his friends didn't have fathers. There were, and I don't think that was that abnormal a demographic, but, there wasn't a real masculine figure there. And one of the themes that runs through this is sort of that powerless feeling and wanting to have an effect somewhere and wanting to be able to see that effect. And the book is about more than just James Holmes. And if you look at cases beyond that, you get more of a sense of that. So I don't know if you can make any direct correlation between watching a violent video game and doing something destructive, but it doesn't seem like the best preparation for being sensitively attuned to the society you're in and other people.
And another point is that after we wrote the book, we became aware of this term that had started to be used in groups that I didn't know existed called incels, INCELS. So we started looking into that. And this Elliot Rogers, who was the shooter in, I think it was Isla Vista, California. Isla Vista.
Yep.
He was sort of the role model for a lot of these young men that believed in that misogynistic kind of, well, I can't get a woman to date me, so I hate women. And it was interesting that James Holmes wrote in the Spiral Notebook, the latest battle I lost is when I succumbed to falling in love. He had a very hard time dealing normally with women his age. young women his age. He had broken up with a girl at, I think it was at CU Medical Center where he was going to school. So we do see some similarities between some of these shooters that have, this anger at women, anger at somebody, so you're going to take it out on a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, and if you go fast forward to this year on November 7th, and it might have been after the Thousand Oaks shooting, I think it was, November 7th, 2018, there had been 307 mass shootings in the United States this year. So, that's 10 months and 7 days. That's roughly 307 days. There had been 307 mass shootings, which is defined as 4 more dead, not just victims, but you have to be dead. So it's obviously a culture-wide phenomenon, and we were kind of trying to get below the surface of that and really go into the more in-depth emotional
and also more in depth into what is aberrant in our society, rather just one aberrant individual.
Right. The psychiatric profession and law enforcement and a lot of things, they tend to look at it that way. Well, this is just a really screwed up individual, which is usually true, but that individual is also the product of a society. And since we couldn't really get to the core documents around the individual, in this case, Holmes, we broadened the investigation. And I think there's a lot of information in the book about the things we're talking about that's pretty useful, apart from just this one case.
It's interesting that you mentioned incels, because that was actually one of the questions I wanted to bring up about this. Are the idea of, so obviously you know about incels. There's another group become a little bit more popular maybe in the last few years or so called MGTOW, which is men going their own way. And these guys are a little different than incels in that they have had dates before, or they've been married, or they've been with women before in some kind of relationship capacity. But now they're purposely choosing to not be with women because of perceived injustices that woman has caused to them, or women in general to men in our society. And I wanted to ask you about that topic.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I had never heard of that group.
Yeah, so I'll
have to look into that.
Yeah, they might be worth checking out, because the incels, I mean, that was a term that I was only introduced to maybe 4 months ago, and once I heard the term, I thought of a couple people I know where it's like, okay, that guy, he can't get a date. I mean, he doesn't identify as it, but there's some guys I know where it's like, oh, they could, I guess, technically qualify because they're involuntary celibates, right? They want to be with women,
right?
But they can't be with women, right?
Right.
And
right, but you say this other group is not exactly like incels then.
No, I mean, both groups ultimately, they're not in serious relationships with women, but one is more they choose it, and the other one is that they can't. Like, they can't be in relationships with women. Either, they ask out girls and girls say no, or they're too afraid to ask out women. Those are the incels, right? But MGTOW, they can, or they have in the past, and, for whatever reason, they say if you get married to a woman, she'll end up divorcing you and taking your kids in divorce court, or whatever. You know what I mean? There's a litany of reasons to not be with women. But I was going to ask you if there was, because especially if you read, as you're probably familiar with, with incels, there's a lot of, I guess, information on the internet that exists that's very dark and very just negative. I mean, I know that this Holmes case happened, 6 years ago, so a lot's changed on the internet since then, but in that time frame, I mean, there's forums online for incel groups that are very just dark and just depressing.
Yeah, you're right.
But it's part of what we're saying, that it's not just then the individual. You've got all these social mechanisms that are probably encouraging people to think more in whatever way they're thinking. In other words, if they're thinking women are bad, now you have a World Wide Web, to encourage you to think in that direction, and that's beyond just an individual thing. But if I could ask you a question, I mean, because of your age and you knowing men of that age who are somewhat similar to that, what's your explanation for their behavior?
I think in regards to the mass shootings today, I think a lot of it is the over medicating of youth. I think that's definitely one problem. I think the exposure to violent content is also bad, and I think I mean, there's so many layers. I mean, there's those two things. I think there's also the breakdown of youth from wanting to actually be adults. So you have a lot of people that are in their 20s or maybe even into their 30s that are, maybe they're working professionals, but they're also in a state of arrested development where they, even if they have their own place, their mentality isn't that of an adult. I mean, I understand that, when you get older, I mean, you don't have to give up everything that you liked as a child, but, the idea of being a fanboy into your 30s and your 40s and,
Yeah.
getting very involved in this internet culture instead of an idea of, getting married and living like an adult. People want to live like kids. And, there's the term man boy, right? And I mean, obviously, it also applies to women too, but I think at least for the shooters, I think it's guys that just feel out of place in society. And then you mix that with mental illness and then the access to guns or the abilities to have guns that shoot off all these rounds. I think it just makes a very
Yeah.
dangerous cocktail, in my opinion. I mean, again, you guys wrote a book about it.
Well, yeah, but see, when in writing the book, it wasn't like we were trying to profess that we were the authorities on all of these subjects. Well, all we wanted to do is what we're doing with you right now, which is start a dialogue. Get people talking about it. Don't just shove it under the rug every time one of these events happens, but start, analyzing and asking questions and talking to your kids and talking to people and trying to help figure out what could we do to help? What can we do to change?
Right.
That's really the thrust of the book, is to start a dialogue and not talk about it.
Well,
anymore.
and we all feel like victims. I mean, what if you go to the grocery store and you get shot, or the hospital,
or a concert, or anywhere?
How can you be a participant with this stuff as not just a victim? And that's just what Joyce said. I mean, instead of shoving it under the rug, talking about it, exploring it, opening up some of these other doors, trying to see the connections between the people who actually do this. And, a lot of them, I mean, I was just, reading something today out of the Spiral Notebook, but this one guy who was going to commit a mass murder, and he was arrested right before it, he said, if somebody had come to him and talked to him and tried to talk him out of this right before that, he wouldn't have done it. There's this almost, and it was in homes, it runs through there, and a lot of people almost desperate need to make some kind of human connection that was real.
Well, like in the Holmes case, in that his mother, during the trial, when his mother was testifying, she said, the psychiatrist did not inform her that he had been threatening to kill a bunch of people.
Yep.
She said, if I would have known that, if the psychiatrist had just told me that, I would have crawled on my knees back from San Diego to get to him.
Right. He actually told his therapist that he wanted to, quote, kill a lot of people, and she put him on drugs. I mean, it's not just the individual. That's what we're saying.
I mean, because even a lot of those similarities seem like they run through with the borderline shooter, in that he was the same way. I mean, he was in his late 20s. He was 28, and he had all these posts on social media talking about wanting to commit a mass murder and doing things like that. And yeah, I mean, I think he lived at home, but he was on some kind of psychedelic drugs or something like that, or some prescription drugs. But yeah,
Right.
I think he was a person that felt very out of place in society. Here he was a veteran, but he was like 27, 28, something like that. And he lived at home. So I don't know his whole background. I might be wrong in some of these facts.
Well, I believe his quote was, I'm not insane, I'm just bored.
Yeah.
I mean, he just, and again, that's a kind of a theme, I want to create an impact of some kind because I can't figure out how to do anything else.
Well, and there was a really good quote by Holmes in the Spiral Notebook, and I wish we had access to the Spiral Notebook before we wrote the book, but much of it came out after the trial and after he was sentenced, and he said, these are his words, "The message, there is no message.
Yeah.
Most fools will interpret correlation for causation, namely relationship and work failure, as causes. Both were expediting catalysts, not the reason. The causation being my state of mind for the past 15 years. And embraced the hatred and Dark Knight Rises." I mean, he really identified with the Joker, I feel, in that Dark Knight Rises movie, in that Batman movie. There was a quote in that movie that said, some people just want to sit back and watch the world burn.
Right. And I don't know if you understand exactly what we're saying, that our book is called The Spiral Notebook, and that's because on the day of his crime, he sent his own spiral notebook, his diary essentially, to his therapist, basically saying, maybe since you wouldn't treat me when I was there, you can understand that the next person who comes in and says they want to kill a lot of people, maybe you'll do something different. Inside the spiral notebook that he mailed to her were some partially burnt $20 bills, which was a direct reference to what the Joker did in The Dark Knight, where he burns up, I don't know if it's 30,000 or $30 million dollars or something. And he was just saying, here's your society. It's all about money. It's not about, human values. So, I mean, he's making a huge social statement in what he's doing.
Well, what I thought was very interesting about the fact that, James Holmes, he committed the murder, after he was inspired somewhat by The Dark Knight, like what you said with Joker, and then he went to the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises. And there's a scene in The Dark Knight Rises, I'm sure you guys are very aware of this. There's a scene where the main antagonist in that film, Bane, and he has a couple henchmen, they go into something akin to the New York Stock Exchange, and they go in there with all these people, and they just start shooting people. Like, they kill people that you would call, quote, innocent people that are just in a room of people, right? And I remember when that movie came out, I remember, obviously the shooting happening and making the news. And when I watched the film in theaters, I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, this definitely doesn't feel kosher. There's something about this that feels really kind of...
really dark.
Yeah, exactly.
Truly dark.
Well,
yeah.
And I think, again, I mean, when you use the term mental health, it's a very slippery word. Mental illness, what is it, what isn't it? Are you mentally ill sometimes and not other times? There's a lot that runs through this stuff that is people trying to make some sort of statement. I mean, it's a totally perverse, destructive, and awful statement, but they're not just acting in a total vacuum. I mean, I think that's sort of what you're saying, and it's what what I was saying earlier. I want to do something with my life, but I don't know what to do. And that to think that we're living in a society where that becomes the best option for you is pretty remarkable.
So to kind of pivot to another book that you guys wrote, you wrote a book called Anyone You Want Me to Be. I think I mean, at least in my own mind, I feel like there might be some crossover somewhat with the last topic that we just went over. And yeah, I just figured if you guys maybe wouldn't mind talking about that book a little bit and what it's about and its impact.
Well, when we write a book or look for a subject, our phrase is always, we're looking for a crime that illustrates some sort of larger social problem or social reality. So it's not just, Joe got angry and shot the guy next door. You're looking for that larger thing to write about. The internet basically came online for most people, I would say, 1996, 7 or something like that. And so the man who commits the crimes in Anyone You Want Me to Be, John E. Robinson of suburban Kansas City, was a serial criminal and serial killer before the internet, but was probably the first person in the world to use the internet to conduct his next phase of serial killing.
He actually to lure women.
Exactly. So the larger story is, look at this new dangerous criminal realm and how vulnerable some people could be to it. And
at the time, the law enforcement was not up to the criminal.
Yeah.
Not the same level. They didn't. They had a long way to go to figure out. They didn't know, I think, much about the dark web then, and it was just in its infancy, really.
Yeah. So here was a guy who was, basically looking for victims, in his neighborhood or something, and suddenly, the internet connects him to women all over the country. I mean, unlimited number of potential victims, and that's kind of how he operated.
And he was like an Eagle Scout, and he was respectable businessman in the community and in the church, the local church. And here he had this dark side that no one knew about, including his wife, presumably. She said she never knew about it, where he would go online and he would meet a variety of women, and then eventually, and with some of them, he would get their Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare. There was a mother and a daughter that he lured to Kansas City suburbs and ended up killing them, and then he would just continue on getting their benefits. Right. He was a true psychopath. Unlike James Holmes, I think he wasn't mentally ill. He was just, he seemed to have no conscience, like a sociopath or psychopath. And it was interesting because he would lure not only older women, but younger women. He had a woman that was into Gothic dress-up games, fantasy games. Some of the women got involved with S&M games with him. And then he would bury their bodies in 55-gallon drums out in his rural property and in his storage unit.
Right. So probably the first person to actually understand how this technology could be used for extreme criminal behavior.
I mean, for somebody like him, I mean, as you mentioned with Holmes, I mean, there's maybe that element of there's mental illness, there's other societal factors. I mean, there's still that element of he had a choice and there's evil to him as well. But with this person, with Robinson, I mean, it just sounds like he might just be evil. I mean, obviously, you guys must believe in evil after all the cases that you've written about, right?
That's a really good philosophical question.
Well, yeah. To me, I mean, it may not be a distinguishing point to others, but to me, there's a big difference between somebody like Holmes and those people. And when you think of crime, you typically think of somebody doing something for personal gain or personal revenge or, crime of passion, something like that. And that's what Robinson was. I mean, it was about personal gain and personal power. These other people, again, to me, they're trying to express something, and they're sort of doing it in the worst possible way.
Yeah, like, for example, in the Spiral Notebook, in Holmes's Spiral Notebook, his journal, as opposed to our book, I know it is confusing because of the name, he muses about these very, very, very deep philosophical, spiritual questions, about God. And he was trying to ask the therapist in therapy before the shootings about what she thought about God and what she thought about, life and death and why people die and why some people suffer and all these very high, lofty questions that I think he was struggling with. And she told him, that's not my place to discuss things like that with you. But you could see in his writings that was something that he was really searching for. He was searching for some sort of spiritual, grounding.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, he's obviously very, very bright, and he's studying the brain. I mean, that's what neuroscience is. But you don't get the answer to any of the questions Joyce is talking about by studying the neuronal pathways of the brain. And I think he was on a deep spiritual search. I think some of these people are, but they can't connect to anything.
He was trying to actually use mathematical equations to solve philosophical questions, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if he had hooked up with one person who had sort of engaged with him, it might have been a different story. And that's nobody's fault. But that, to me, is not the same sort of criminal as John Robinson.
Well, for him, yeah, I mean, for Robinson's case, was there any redemption for a person like him? I mean, was there anything that in his life, could he have, because like you said, he was basically utilizing the internet to take advantage of people and to murder them, right? For him,
right.
That's, I don't want to make you guys say anything you don't want to say, but in my opinion, that just sounds evil. It just sounds like a person that knew what right and wrong is and chose to do wrong and indulge in it. it seems like to me.
What he seemed like to me was very greedy, and he thought I think he kind of suffered from that I think I'm the smartest person in the room syndrome. I don't know if you've ever run into people like that, but there are definitely people that think that they're more intelligent than other people and they can get away with many things, and they kind of enjoy that cat and mouse game with the police.
And what makes human beings so complicated is that he was apparently successfully married. You know, his wife, as Joyce said, didn't know what he was doing. He had children. So it's even more complex. I mean, he could be a father, he could be a husband, very functional, you know, be a provider. But
the ability to compartmentalize yourself like that, maybe that is a definition of mental illness. I mean, it's a real good question, because most people couldn't compartmentalize that well where you could function with your family, but then go and kill women and stuff them into, you know, barrels and bury them and take their money from one young woman was in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
That's very hard for your mind to comprehend. But again, we're trying to apply logic, the way we think logically, to something that isn't logical. Yeah. So maybe that is what mental illness is, you know. But you struggle. You still are you're struggling to find an answer. That's what makes studying these type of personalities so fascinating for us. It's the psychology behind it. It's never been about the sensationalist nature of the crime that they committed. It's always been about the psychological factor driving them. That's why Steve and I started writing about these things together, because when I first met him, we both had a shared interest in the Truman Capote book, In Cold Blood. Yeah. And that was, I mean, that itself is a study in how one person might not have been able to commit a crime by themselves, but paired with the right person, the right combination of personalities together, they could carry out that heinous crime.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting to me that, you know, you raised the point of a person can do these horrendous things to other people, but then to their own family and to people that they know directly, they're not monsters. And I mean, that kind of in my mind raises the idea of, you know, maybe like a father that, you know, has a daughter, but then he sexually molests other girls, or he's looking for that. Like, I remember the show To Catch a Predator, right? You would hear these men that would go on, right? And they would say something, you know, they were going there to meet a girl that was 13 or 14. And then, you know, they'd be talking to Chris Hansen and they'd say something like, oh, I have a daughter and she's, you know, the exact same age, basically, as the girls that they were going to, you know, molest. And I mean, maybe a lot of those guys, maybe they also did molest their own daughters or nieces or things like that. But I had to imagine that not all of them did. And in my mind, it would seem very, I'm trying to think of the word. I mean, it just seems so crazy to me that a person could be willing to do some kind of crime that heinous, you know, kill a woman that's exactly their wife's age or their mother's age or their daughter's age, or do some horrendous thing to them.
Right.
But there's people that in their own lives that are exact in a similar position or a similar situation.
Or that they could show love to. They can show love for this person and total, absolutely animalistic behavior towards another person. Right. That right there will be fascinating to people for the rest of humanity's time on Earth. I mean, you'll never be able to quite figure it out, I don't think.
When we were researching the Spiral Notebook, we talked to people who were in the neuroscience department with James Holmes, professors, people who were teaching him. And one man said, we understand 1% of how the brain works. And I've never forgotten that. You know, we just, and then he studied the brain, you know, professionally. And it is, and one other thing is that when John Robinson was arrested, and it was all, you know, front page of the newspaper, he killed all these women who were in their 20s and then older. And I went to the jail where he was to get in to interview him a few weeks after his arrest. And I just got to the point of talking to him, and his daughter came in and ran me off. I mean, she was bound and determined to protect him from the bad press, right? I mean, the woman was exactly the same age as the women he was killing, and she was there defending him as strongly as she could. I mean, it was, you know, it was pretty mind twisting.
Yeah, we've run into a lot of interesting experiences like that throughout the years. Steve wrote a book called Sweet Evil about a woman who was in her 20s that killed her lover's wife because he convinced her through biblical passages that it would be okay, the use of religion to twist her mind in this very twisted fashion. And we went and interviewed her in prison. And it's always very interesting to interview these killers in prison because it doesn't happen very often, mostly because their lawyers will always say, no, you don't, because maybe their case is on appeal, or the lawyers will hardly ever let you talk to a convicted killer. And we did get to go into Canyon City and talk to her on several occasions. And she'd gunned down this other woman. They were both young mothers of young children, and she dressed in her husband's camouflage army outfit. He was in the army, and dressed like a man, walked like a man, and shot this woman down in cold blood as she came out of a lupus support meeting in Colorado Springs. And we're sitting there, right across from her years later, talking to her, trying to ask her about the moment of when you kill someone like that. What are you feeling? How did you feel? What was going on in your mind? And the closest we ever got to any answer was, she, and I don't know if this is true with all, but with her, it was sort of like the only way that she could exist in prison and with herself was to compartmentalize that, sort of like the devil made me do it. I can't think about that moment too much. It was hard for her to live with herself knowing that she did that.
It was disassociation.
Yeah.
And I've seen that more than once.
Right.
Where somebody will say, well, I really wasn't there, or that wasn't me. And then I came back afterwards, and now I have to live with who I am.
Yeah.
But again, it's a psychological state that, we're still trying to understand.
And this is a woman that never had a parking ticket. She was an upstanding, very intelligent, very likable young woman. I would have been friends with her under other circumstances. And you're just sitting there across from them I remember looking at her hands and just thinking, those normal-looking hands picked up a gun and just shot someone down in cold blood. You can't believe it.
And you're thinking, well, they have the answer, if they just tell me. But they don't. They don't, in some cases, really know why they did something like that.
One of the main elements of the Robinson murders, like you mentioned, was the idea of using the internet to, basically, to set up meetings with these women or to interact with them and to get to know them. Obviously, with the internet, it's just gaining more popularity every year and every day, and these apps are becoming more popular. Have you guys seen or have you read about any of the statistics about murders like those being increased by, Craigslist interactions, like people seeking sexual partners, or Tinder usage, or Plenty of Fish, or eHarmony, anything like that, any kind of online dating site or place where people can interact with each other? Are there murderers doing things like that using those apps today? Like, are there any popular cases of that, or is that really
you hear,
prevalent?
the occasional crime like that. You hear somebody was hooked up with somebody in a place and were murdered, but Robinson was just systematic. I haven't heard of anything like that since then, where somebody was doing it. He had 5 computers in his home. His wife would get up in the morning, go to work. He'd turn these on, and he'd start looking hunting, basically hunting.
Trolling, hunting.
Yeah. So in that case, I haven't heard of another example that dramatic.
Wow. Because, it just seems like with all these apps today, there very much is a culture of people that are willing to meet up with someone that they don't know and have an intimate meeting with them. And, that's it. I've known guys that will, they'll use like an app like Tinder, and, they'll hook up with a woman that they don't even know, and they'll go back to her house. And I think to myself, like, even if you're the guy, you're setting yourself up potentially to get murdered or something, or to be robbed. You don't know this woman. You met her on Tinder, and you go back to her parents' house, wherever house she says that she's living at, and you don't know what's waiting for you there. So that's the only reason why I asked that question.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of anyone that fits the description of the Robinson case.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
And that's a good thing.
yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, definitely. I wanna thank you guys for coming on. I know there was initially 3 books that I want to speak with you guys about, but I feel like the last 2 are so heavy. I don't know if I have it in me spiritually to talk about anymore. But I definitely want to thank you guys for your time. How can we follow all the work that you guys do? And are you guys, have any books been released recently over the last few years or so that we should check out or take a look at?
Well, I just wanted to say one thing. First of all, thank you for having us on. It's always good to have a dialogue about these types of things. I mean, I learned something from you today about a group I didn't know existed. So, you never know what's going to come from just talking about these subjects. And but we have been approached by a documentarian who's doing a documentary next year. I think it's going to be released next year on America. And Eric and Steve and I will have been asked to appear in that along with a lot of other people. So if people want to follow when that comes out or other things that we're working on, if they just go to our website, which is stephensingular.com, and that's Stephen with a PH. We always update that and let people know when there's going to be a television appearance or a book released or something like that, and especially about this documentary.
Right. And then I recently had published this small book called Stolen Future, The Untold Story of the 2000 Election, which connects to not only the 2000 election, but the 2004 and 16 presidential elections, and then even on into all these problems that surrounded the midterms this year, just a month ago. So it's a very short book, about 35 to 40 pages, on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, Kobo, other platforms. Very short, easy read that I think would tell people something about the origins of these election problems that they may not know. So that's just come out, and the screenplay we talked about is referenced on the website as well, and we'll keep that updated on that particular project. So, yeah, we're doing several things now, and they hope to come to fruition next year.
All right, great. Well, thank you again, Steve and Joyce. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
All right, thanks,
All right.
Marcus.
All right,
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.